When I played Hades for the first time, I paused at the keepsake selection screen, captivated by the little details Supergiant Games had woven into this simple menu. When a developer puts this much love into the small things, it's a good sign that the rest of the game will be just as polished. I had the same feeling when I first loaded up Holder of Place, a new roguelike autobattler from a small team of indie developers. As you click through the main menu, the title flickers and turns partially red. The ambient music respectfully fades in, and the interface transforms smoothly into the game's UI. Each element introduces itself with a flicker, and the timeline at the top of the screen clicks into place. Finally, you're presented with the first event of the game, accompanied by short flavor text reminiscent of a fail-better game like Sunless Sea. There are no decisions to make yet, but the game pauses, inviting you to settle in before you take control. It's these little touches that signal we're in for something special. Let's get started and see if Holder of Place lives up to the promise of its polished first impression. You begin with a single follower who does nothing and has mediocre stats, and you have the capacity for 5 followers in total, at least at the beginning of the game. Combat proceeds in a turn-based fashion, with your followers attacking first, followed by the enemies. When a unit attacks another unit, it deals damage but doesn't take any in return. So the fact that you have the first turn is a significant advantage, as you can eliminate enemies before they have a chance to retaliate. You don't have direct control over your followers during combat, but you can arrange them in a specific order before each encounter to take advantage of their abilities or line up your attacks based on the lineup that the enemy presents. Defeating enemies provides you with the game's currency, faith. You earn 1 faith for each enemy you defeat in combat. Following a combat encounter, you're presented with a shop where you can spend faith to purchase additional followers or traits to improve your existing followers. You can only purchase at most 1 thing from each shop, but you can additionally lock an option so that it appears in subsequent shops as well. As an auto-battler, your goal is to assemble a team of followers to progress through a series of increasingly challenging encounters. In fact, the game calls encounters excisions, but I find that word a bit too pretentious, so I'll stick with encounters for now. In the first shop, I purchased an Initiate, a follower who generates 1 faith at the start of each combat. I've played roguelikes before, and it's rarely a bad idea to invest in a resource-generating follower early on. In the early game, encounters gradually scale up simply and predictably in both number of enemy units and their strength. But as the game progresses, you encounter more complex enemy groups with unique abilities, which we'll talk about in a moment. One interesting thing about the shops in Holder of Place is that the contents of the shop scale with the amount of faith that you have. So if you have more faith, you'll see more expensive and more powerful followers in the shop. This makes saving up faith a viable strategy, especially if you can skirt by an encounter with your current roster. That's why in the second shop I purchased another Wanderer, the weakest follower in the game, because I wanted to save faith for better options later on. This system does have its drawbacks though. It's not difficult to end up in a lose more death spiral if you constantly need to invest faith to survive, but you're not earning enough faith to purchase followers that can carry you to the late game. This problem is exacerbated by the game's very forgiving core health system. You start the game with 5 core health, and you lose 1 core health for every encounter that you lose. But losing an encounter still increases the depth, making the following encounter more difficult. So if you're struggling, you're likely to lose several in a row, knowing that there's nothing you can really do about it except watch your core health dwindle away. This could be mitigated by adding some sort of comeback mechanic to the shop, like a discount on the first purchase after losing an encounter. I understand why the core health system exists, because it synergizes with the game's final boss, which we'll discuss later, but I think it makes the rest of the game weaker. I would personally have more fun if the game was less forgiving, creating more tension and making decisions in the early to mid game more impactful. Holder of Place runs are only around 25 minutes long, so it's not like you're losing a huge amount of time if you lose a run. And it's more painful to watch a run slowly fall apart than just be confronted with the reality that your team composition isn't good enough to continue up front. Anyway, in the early game I'm continuing to create a faith engine, selecting followers that synergize with faith production in some way, with the intention of pivoting to some sort of scaling strategy when I see something suitable in the shop. Your progression through the game is indicated by the timeline at the top of the screen, which advances in depth for each encounter and shop. But you can also stumble upon special events, which present a selection of choices that can have a variety of effects on your followers or your faith. There's one other type of event too, but we'll talk about that later. Unlike a game like Slay the Spire, where you can see the entire map and plan a route, the timeline is simplified and linear. There may be some randomness in the depths at which you encounter events, but it's not particularly clear to the player and it's hard to play around. I would like to see more transparency in the timeline so I can make more informed decisions about which events to pursue. Although if it turns out that the path is completely predetermined, it rewards repeat play and memorization in a fairly traditional roguelike sense. The events are coupled with some lovely flavor text, which I've already compared to fail-better games. The writing is evocative and mysterious, and it's a pleasure to read through the events, even if they don't have a huge impact on the gameplay yet. Holder of Place is still in active development, but it's already showing a lot of promise. What we see today is an impressive vertical slice of the game with a lot of polish and a clear vision. It evolved from a prototype which already received a lot of positive feedback. Since the prototype, the developers have tweaked some of the numbers, massively overhauled the visual and sound design, and refined and simplified many of the core mechanics, including removing an interaction between core health and faith. This is probably another reason that core health is so forgiving right now, because it used to do something else and the developers haven't yet found a way to make it more punishing without breaking the game. I hope to see Holder of Place continue to grow and evolve, and I'm excited to see what the developers have in store for the future. I'm looking forward to seeing more complex enemy groups, more events and more followers, and I hope the developers can find a way to make the game more challenging without making it more punishing. Since the game is already fun and complete, it's now a matter of adding more content and balancing the existing content to make it more engaging and replayable. This is the sort of game that could thrive with an extended early access period, where the developers can gather feedback and iterate on the game's design in the same way that Hades and Slay the Spire did. The final type of encounter in Holder of Place is a hunt. These are mini-boss encounters that are significantly more difficult than regular encounters. Hunt enemies are unique and have special abilities that can be challenging to deal with, like scaling summons, limits on incoming damage, or massive health pools. In return, they give powerful rewards in addition to faith, like additional follower capacity or permanent scaling for your followers. The game gives you the choice to attempt or skip a hunt, but because of the core health system, there's very little reason to skip a hunt. Even if you're not prepared, you can potentially dispatch 1 or 2 enemies, which will give you some additional faith despite missing out on the larger reward. In this first hunt, the hobgoblin is protected by some small minions and scales its attack damage after every attack. Since I've built a faith engine, I'm woefully unprepared for the first hunt, but I attempt it anyway and I'm able to take out the minions and deal some damage to the hobgoblin. This rewards me with 3 faith from the enemies that I killed, plus an additional 5 faith from my followers' abilities at the cost of 1 core health. As far as I can tell, that's a fantastic trade, but if the core health system didn't exist or had a smaller health pool, I would have had to make a more difficult decision about whether to attempt the hunt or not. After the first hunt, it seems like a good time to pivot to a strategy that can carry to the late game. In this shop, I discover a scaling follower, the Reaper, which gains permanent attack damage and health at the start of each combat in exchange for 3 faith. This is the sort of thing I was looking for, and I purchased the Reaper immediately. It doesn't feel like it will be sufficient on its own to beat the game, but it's definitely a step in the right direction. Here's another nice touch about the hunts that nods to the game's polish and roguelike heritage. After the first hunt, the top right corner of the screen is populated with a new counter, which counts down to the next hunt. It would have been easy to just show the counter from the beginning, but the developers chose to keep it hidden until you've experienced a hunt for yourself for the first time. This is a small detail, but it's the kind of thing that makes me think the developers are paying attention to the right things. Discovering new mechanics through play is a core tenet of roguelikes, and it's nice to see the game respect that tradition. It also assists the new player experience by allowing the player to focus on the core mechanics of the game in the first few deaths, before introducing more elaborate ideas. Even though we've spent the game so far creating a faith engine, a cost of 3 faith per combat is significant, especially if we want to balance our Reaper scaling with the need to purchase additional followers. Fortunately, in the next shop we find a diligent aspect, which we can attach to the Reaper and will generate 1 faith every time the Reaper takes damage. Since the Reaper is already our tankiest follower and will continue to scale in health, this seems like a natural fit. This also synergizes with the Emissary we already had on our team, which will effectively double our faith gain. This is the sort of emergent strategy that I love to see in games like this. The arrival of the diligent aspect in the shop has smoothed out the transition from a faith engine to a scaling strategy, which further commits me to the Reaper as a core part of my team. It encourages me to move the Reaper to the front of our lineup to maximise the number of instances of damage it takes. If I can ensure that the Reaper will continue to scale at every combat, by the late game the Reaper will be a powerhouse that can carry me through the final encounters. I'm already building up a narrative in my head for how the Reaper will progress throughout this run. By the end of the game, I'll be looking to move the Reaper to the back of the lineup where it can be protected by other followers like the Hobgoblin did. I'll also be looking to replace the diligent aspect with something that can capitalise on the Reaper's huge stats, and I find exactly what I'm looking for in the next shop. I see the charging aspect, which will allow the Reaper to attack an additional time. It's too early to replace the diligent aspect right now, but I can lock this item in the shop, so it'll be available when I decide to pivot from the mid game to the late game. I also see another Reaper in the shop, and since I'm already excited about Reapers, I add it to my team without much thought. Although it does put more strain on our faith supply, and in hindsight I'm not sure whether this was the right decision. As our strategy continues to unfold, let's reflect on the long-term potential of Holder of Place. There's a fairly established pattern of early access development for this style of game, which led to the success of games like Hades and Slay the Spire. I've always admired Slay the Spire's approach to development, which was a rather scientific affair, using a data-driven approach to balance cards around their pick rates amongst other things. As a software developer myself and a mathematician, this approach to tuning the numbers on cards really appeals to me. Holder of Place's polished core mechanics and thoughtful design choices suggest a strong foundation for future development, and the fact that it's already fun to play today is an extremely positive sign. On the main menu, the game indicates that relics and factions are in development. As I understand it, relics will function much like the relics in Slay the Spire, and factions like character classes, which change the pool of available followers depending on the faction that you choose. Besides that, there is scope to expand the journey itself with additional events and more choice or transparency in the timeline. The game is also fairly short, at about 20 to 30 minutes, so it would be natural to add additional acts beyond the current final boss, in the same way that Hades launched in early access with only 2 biomes and bosses. I'd also like to see the difficulty of the game increased, either by introducing a hard mode that removes the core health system or by adding an ascension system. As it is, after a few playthroughs to get familiar with the available units and hunts, it should be possible for a merely semi-competent player to guarantee a win every time, which doesn't appeal to the desire for mastery that other successful roguelikes produce. For a roguelike, you really want to progress from the class of games which is fun to play 2 or 3 times to discover the mechanics, to one that can be replayed endlessly to master intricacies. The final challenge of the game is the dragon, and I know I've harped on about the flavor text in the game enough already, but just listen to this. The very quiet of reality. You are now in the presence of a beholder. That's just awesome. Dragons are obviously pretty overdone, but Holder of Place manages to still make them feel fresh. How do you come up with something like quiet of reality? It's just so transcendental. The dragon's unique twist is that the fight takes place over the course of multiple encounters, with damage persisting between them, and the dragon gaining new followers each time. This is a great way to make the final boss feel epic, and as far as I can tell, it's the entire reason that the core health system exists. You're supposed to lose some combats with the dragon, although it is possible to defeat it in a single encounter if you're well prepared. In this run, it took 3 attempts to eventually vanquish the dragon, and it did feel a little inevitable by the end. I'd like to see the dragon evolve a little more throughout the fight, perhaps by gaining additional abilities or by introducing a mandatory second phase. But still, the final encounter is a satisfying conclusion to the run, and a test of the strategy that you've built up over the course of the game. Holder of Place shows a tremendous amount of potential for a game still in active development. With polished mechanics, thoughtful design choices, and an evocative narrative style, it stands as a strong entry into the autobattler roguelike genre. The game's blend of intricate strategy, emergent gameplay, and elegant attention to detail make it fun to play, and its short runs make it accessible without sacrificing depth. However, some systems like the forgiving core health mechanic may dilute the tension that defines the best roguelikes. With more development, especially in terms of challenge and content expansion, Holder of Place could mature into a standout indie game worthy of multiple playthroughs for both casual players and mastery seekers. The game's success will depend on how the developers balance the intricacies of progression, challenge, and replayability. If the team can find a way to refine its difficulty curve, introduce more content, and perhaps implement an ascension system or hard mode, Holder of Place could be as replayable and addictive as genre greats like Slay the Spire. It's a game to watch as it evolves, and it's already well on its way to becoming a polished gem in the roguelike auto-battler space. If you enjoyed this review and playthrough, don't forget to hit the like button. It helps the channel grow and lets me know you want to see more content like this. And if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe for more in-depth game reviews, let's plays, and indie game discoveries.